Everyone called him a monster, but nobody ever asked why he became one. Julian Whitmore heard those words whispered about him for years, until they became the only story people believed. In the world of powerful families and strict alpha and omega traditions, reputation could decide a person's entire future. And Julian had been given the worst reputation of all, the evil step omega, the one everyone warned others about, the one they believed wanted power, attention, and control. But the truth was far more complicated. Julian never wanted to be feared. He only wanted a place where he could finally belong. When he arrived at the Sterling estate, the grand mansion felt less like a home and more like a courtroom. Every conversation stopped when he entered a room. Every smile seemed carefully chosen. Everyone watched him as if they were waiting for him to reveal some hidden plan. Julian knew those looks well. In his old life, he had spent years trying to prove people wrong. He explained himself. He apologized. He tried to show kindness to people who had already decided who he was. But nothing changed. So this time, he made a different choice. He would stop chasing approval from people who refused to see him. The morning he entered the Sterling family dining room, the atmosphere was exactly as he expected. Cold, formal, distant. At the end of the table sat Alexander Sterling, the ice-cold alpha known throughout the city for his intelligence, discipline, and unreadable emotions. Alexander was the person everyone respected and the person Julian needed to be most careful around. The alpha looked at him with calm gray eyes, studying every movement. "I assume you know why you are here," Alexander said. Julian placed his cup down gently and met his gaze. "I know what everyone thinks I am here for." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "And what is that?" Julian gave a small, quiet smile. "To cause problems." The room became silent. In the past, Julian would have become defensive. He would have tried to convince Alexander that he was wrong. But now, he simply accepted the accusation without letting it define him. That reaction surprised Alexander. The alpha had expected arrogance. He had expected manipulation. Instead, he saw someone who seemed tired of fighting a battle nobody wanted him to win. Later that day, Alexander watched Julian from a distance. He noticed small details that did not match the rumors. Julian thanked the household staff. He listened before speaking. He avoided unnecessary attention. Nothing about him looked like the person everyone described. Alexander disliked uncertainty. His entire life was built on understanding situations before they became problems. But Julian Whitmore was becoming a question he could not answer. Meanwhile, Julian stood alone near the estate garden, looking across the quiet landscape. He knew Alexander would not trust him easily. He knew the past could not disappear overnight. But he also knew one thing. This time, he would not play the role everyone expected. If they wanted to call him a villain, they could. Julian already knew the truth. And sooner or later, Alexander Sterling would discover it too. Alexander Sterling had spent years learning one simple rule: never judge a person by emotions, only by facts. Yet Julian Whitmore was becoming the one person who challenged everything Alexander believed. After the first meeting at the Sterling estate, Alexander decided to observe Julian closely. He told himself it was because the step omega represented a possible risk to the family. He needed to understand his intentions. He needed to know what Julian was planning. But the more Alexander watched, the less sense the rumors made. Julian did not behave like someone searching for power. He did not demand attention. He did not try to impress anyone. Instead, he quietly moved through the estate, treating everyone with the same respect regardless of their position. One morning, Alexander saw Julian helping an elderly staff member organize documents in the library. It was a small moment, something most people would have ignored. But Alexander noticed. The person described as selfish was taking time to help someone else without expecting anything in return. Later that afternoon, Alexander found Julian in the garden, reading beside the flowers. The peaceful scene felt completely different from the image he had been given. "You are different from what I expected," Alexander said. Julian looked up calmly. "Is that disappointing?" Alexander studied his expression. "I am not sure yet." Julian closed the book in his hands. "That is probably the first honest answer I have heard from you." The words were not meant as an insult. They were simply the truth. Alexander realized Julian was not trying to win his approval. That made him more difficult to understand. Most people around Alexander carefully chose their words because they wanted something from him. Julian spoke honestly because he no longer seemed interested in pretending. That was new. That was unexpected. During a family meeting later in the week, the topic of Julian's position in the Sterling household became the center of discussion. Several family members questioned whether he could be trusted. They repeated old stories and assumptions that had followed Julian for years. Alexander watched Julian carefully, expecting him to react. But Julian remained calm. "I understand why you believe those things," Julian said quietly. "But believing a story does not always mean knowing the truth." The room became silent. Alexander noticed something important in that moment. Julian was not fighting to prove everyone wrong. He was simply standing firmly as himself. After the meeting ended, Alexander found himself thinking about those words. He had spent so much time searching for evidence that Julian was dangerous that he never searched for evidence that Julian was misunderstood. Meanwhile, Julian walked alone through the estate halls, knowing Alexander was beginning to question everything. He also knew trust would not appear overnight. The damage created by years of rumors could not disappear in a single day. But for the first time, Julian saw something change in Alexander's eyes. The Alpha was no longer looking at him like an enemy. He was looking at him like a mystery he wanted to solve. The truth about Julian Whitmore was hidden behind years of assumptions, but Alexander Sterling was beginning to see the cracks in the story everyone believed. The more time he spent watching Julian, the more he realized that the Step Omega did not behave like someone with a secret plan. He behaved like someone who had already accepted that nobody would believe him. That difference stayed in Alexander's mind. One afternoon, Alexander reviewed old family records in his office at Sterling Industries. He expected to find information that confirmed his doubts about Julian. Instead, he found small details that made him pause. Every situation where Julian had been blamed seemed incomplete. Every rumor had missing pieces. Every accusation had another side that nobody wanted to discuss. Alexander leaned back in his chair, staring at the documents in silence. For the first time, he wondered if the problem was never Julian's actions. Maybe the problem was that everyone had already decided the meaning behind them. Later that day, Alexander found Julian in the estate library. The room was quiet, filled with warm afternoon light and the soft sound of pages turning. Julian looked peaceful, completely different from the person Alexander expected to find. "You spend a lot of time here," Alexander said. Julian looked up from his book. "It is one of the few places where people do not expect me to explain myself." Alexander was surprised by the answer. "Do you always feel like you need to explain yourself?" Julian looked toward the window before replying. "When people only see the worst version of you, eventually you start wondering if they are right." The honesty in his voice caught Alexander's attention. Julian was not asking for sympathy. He was simply sharing a truth he had carried for too long. Alexander understood that feeling more than he wanted to admit. Everyone saw him as the perfect alpha, the one who never made mistakes, the one who always knew the right answer. But nobody asked if carrying that image ever became exhausting. "I thought you wanted control," Alexander said. Julian gave a small smile. "Sometimes people mistake protection for ambition." Those words remained with Alexander long after the conversation ended. That evening, a formal gathering was held at the Sterling estate. Many influential families attended, and Julian knew exactly what kind of atmosphere waited for him. The moment he entered the room, conversations became quieter. Old opinions followed him before he even spoke. But this time, Julian did not feel the need to defend himself. He greeted everyone politely, remained calm, and allowed his actions to speak. Alexander watched from across the room. He noticed something he had never noticed before. Julian was not trying to become accepted by everyone. He was simply being himself, even when acceptance was uncertain. Later, Alexander approached him near the balcony overlooking the city lights. "You are not what they said you were," Alexander admitted. Julian looked at him carefully. "And what did you think I was?" Alexander paused. For once, he did not have an immediate answer. "Someone I needed to be careful around." Julian nodded slowly. "And now?" Alexander looked at him. "Now I think I need to understand you." It was the first time Alexander had admitted uncertainty. And for Julian, it was the first sign that the cold alpha who once judged him was finally seeing the person behind the rumors. Alexander Sterling had spent his entire life believing that people revealed themselves through their choices. But Julian Whitmore was proving that sometimes the truth was hidden beneath the choices others forced upon them. After their conversation on the balcony, something between them quietly changed. Alexander was no longer watching Julian because he expected a mistake. He was watching because he wanted to understand the person behind the rumors. The shift was subtle, but Julian noticed it. The alpha who once looked at him with suspicion now looked at him with curiosity. That difference mattered more than Julian wanted to admit. A few days later, the Sterling family hosted an important gathering at their estate. It was an evening filled with influential guests, carefully chosen conversations, and expectations that everyone should maintain a perfect image. Julian knew this environment well. He knew how quickly a simple sentence could become a rumor. He knew how easily people could misunderstand him. But this time, he refused to let fear control his actions. When guests arrived, Julian greeted them with calm confidence. He did not try to impress anyone. He did not try to prove that he was different. He simply acted with the kindness and honesty he had always carried. Alexander observed him from across the room. He noticed how Julian treated people who had no power or influence the same way he treated important guests. There was no performance, no hidden intention, just sincerity. Then an unexpected conversation changed the atmosphere. One of the family members brought up Julian's past, repeating old assumptions that had followed him for years. The room became quiet, waiting for Julian's reaction. In the past, this would have been the moment where Julian tried to defend himself until exhaustion. But now, he simply looked at the person speaking and answered calmly. A person can be judged many times before anyone takes the time to know them. His words were quiet, but they carried strength. Alexander felt something shift inside him. He finally understood that Julian's silence was never weakness. It was patience. The Omega everyone called manipulative had spent years trying not to become bitter. Later that evening, Alexander found Julian outside in the garden. The city lights reflected in the distance, and the peaceful night felt completely different from the tension inside the mansion. "You handled yourself differently tonight," Alexander said. Julian looked at him. "I learned that fighting every misunderstanding only gives it more power." Alexander thought about those words. He had spent years controlling every situation around him, but Julian had learned something he never had. Sometimes strength came from knowing what was worth protecting. "I owe you an apology," Alexander said. Julian remained quiet. The words were unexpected. "For believing things about you without knowing the truth." For a moment, Julian saw the alpha who had once judged him beginning to change. Not because he was forced to, not because anyone demanded it, because he finally wanted to understand. "Thank you," Julian replied. "That means more than you know." Alexander looked at him carefully. He realized that the person standing in front of him was not someone trying to take advantage of others. Julian was someone who had survived being misunderstood and still chose kindness. That night, Alexander returned to his office with a new question in his mind. If everything he believed about Julian was wrong, what else had he failed to see? The days after the Sterling family gathering felt different for Julian Whitmore. Nothing had changed on the surface. The same grand halls remained. The same people continued their carefully planned conversations. The same rumors still existed in quiet corners. But one thing had changed. Alexander Sterling no longer looked at him like a problem waiting to be solved. He looked at him like a person worth understanding. Julian noticed the difference, even though he tried not to let himself hope too much. Hope had always been dangerous in his experience. Every time he believed someone finally saw him, he ended up disappointed. But Alexander was changing in ways Julian never expected. The ice-cold alpha who once kept everyone at a distance had started asking questions instead of making assumptions. One afternoon, Julian visited Sterling Industries for a family business meeting. The building stood at the center of Chicago, surrounded by tall glass towers and endless movement. Julian remembered how uncomfortable he once felt in places like this. He used to believe he did not belong among people who carried so much influence. But today he walked through the doors calmly. Alexander noticed immediately. "You seem comfortable here," Alexander said as they entered the executive floor. Julian looked around the modern office. "I am learning that belonging is not something other people give you." The answer surprised Alexander. He had spent years believing status came from achievements and reputation. Julian seemed to understand something deeper. During the meeting, several executives discussed a project involving the company's community programs. Julian listened carefully before offering a suggestion. It was not a dramatic speech or an attempt to gain attention. It was simply a thoughtful idea based on understanding people's needs. Alexander watched the reactions around the room. The same people who once underestimated Julian began taking his words seriously. After the meeting ended, Alexander found himself thinking about how often people ignored Julian's intelligence because they were too focused on the image they created of him. Later that evening, a misunderstanding appeared when an old rumor about Julian reached several important guests preparing for an upcoming event. Once again, people questioned his intentions. Once again, Julian became the easiest person to blame. But before he could respond, Alexander stepped forward. "That information is incomplete," Alexander said calmly. Everyone turned toward him. The Alpha rarely involved himself in personal matters, especially public opinions. "If you want to judge Julian, then you should first know the entire truth." Julian looked at Alexander in surprise. This was the first time Alexander had defended him openly. Not because of an obligation, not because of a family agreement, because he believed Julian deserved to be heard. Afterward, Julian found Alexander near the office balcony overlooking the city. "You did not have to do that," Julian said. Alexander looked at the lights below. "I know. Then why did you?" Julian asked. Alexander paused. The answer seemed simple, but admitting it was not. "Because I was wrong before." Those words carried more meaning than a simple apology. Julian realized Alexander was not just changing his opinion. He was changing the way he saw the world. And Alexander realized something too. Protecting Julian no longer felt like a responsibility. It felt like a choice he wanted to make. For the first time, the distance between them was not created by suspicion. It was slowly disappearing because of trust. The truth Julian Whitmore had been protecting for so long was finally beginning to surface, but he never expected Alexander Sterling to be the person standing beside him when it happened. For years, Julian believed he had to carry every misunderstanding alone. He believed no explanation could change a story that had already been written about him. But now, the same Alpha who once judged him without knowing the truth was slowly becoming the person who searched for it. After Alexander defended him at Sterling Industries, their relationship entered a new stage. There was still uncertainty between them, but the distance was no longer built on suspicion. It was built on two people learning how to trust. A few days later, Julian discovered that old documents connected to his family history had been found in the Sterling archives. The information was unexpected. For years, people believed Julian had entered the Sterling family with hidden intentions. They believed every decision he made was part of a plan. But the records revealed something different. Many events from the past had been misunderstood. Several situations where Julian appeared selfish were actually moments when he was trying to protect himself from unfair treatment. Alexander read through the documents carefully, feeling the weight of every misunderstanding he had accepted. He remembered every time he looked at Julian with doubt. Every time he chose rumors over conversations. "I spent so much time trying to discover what you were hiding," Alexander said quietly. "I never considered that you were hiding because nobody gave you a reason to feel safe." Julian looked at him. The honesty in Alexander's voice was different from before. It was not an apology made out of obligation. It was an apology from someone who finally understood the damage caused by his assumptions. "People believe what is easier to believe," Julian replied. "Sometimes the truth is harder to accept." Alexander nodded. He knew exactly what Julian meant. His entire life had been built around expectations. As an alpha from a powerful family, he had always been told what strength should look like. But Julian showed him another kind of strength. The ability to remain kind even after being misunderstood. That evening, Alexander invited Julian to walk through the gardens behind the Sterling estate. The quiet path was surrounded by soft lights, and the peaceful atmosphere gave them a moment away from family expectations. "What would you have done if nobody ever discovered the truth?" Alexander asked. Julian thought for a moment. "I would have continued living. Not because I stopped caring, but because I learned I cannot let other people decide who I am." Those words stayed with Alexander. He realized Julian had already overcome the hardest battle. He no longer needed the world to approve of him. He had already accepted himself. Meanwhile, Julian noticed something changing in Alexander as well. The cold alpha who once appeared impossible to reach was becoming more open. He listened more carefully. He spoke more honestly. He allowed himself to be seen. And that was when Julian understood something important. The person he once feared was not the person standing in front of him now. Alexander was not trying to control his story anymore. He was trying to become part of it. As the night ended, Both of them knew the truth had changed everything. But neither of them realized that the biggest change was still coming. Because soon, Alexander would have to make a choice between protecting his family's image and protecting the person who had changed the way he saw the world. Alexander Sterling had spent his entire life believing that loyalty meant protecting the family name. But Julian Whitmore was teaching him that true loyalty also meant protecting the truth. After discovering the hidden details of Julian's past, Alexander could no longer pretend that nothing had changed. The image of the selfish step Omega everyone warned him about had completely disappeared. In its place was someone far more complicated. Someone who had endured years of judgment and still chose kindness. But understanding Julian was only the beginning. The hardest part was deciding what Alexander was willing to sacrifice for that understanding. The upcoming Sterling family celebration was one of the most important events of the year. Powerful families from across the city would attend, and every action would be carefully observed. Alexander knew the gathering would bring attention to Julian again. He also knew many people still believed the old rumors. Before the event began, Alexander found Julian standing near the garden entrance, quietly looking at the decorations being prepared. "You can still choose not to come," Alexander said. Julian turned toward him with a calm expression. "Why would I leave?" Alexander hesitated. "Because some people will never change their opinion." Julian looked toward the mansion. "I spent too many years leaving places because other people decided I did not belong. I am not doing that anymore." Those words stayed with Alexander. Julian was no longer trying to prove himself. He was simply refusing to disappear. During the celebration, the atmosphere was exactly what Alexander expected. Conversations became quieter when Julian entered. Some guests exchanged doubtful looks. Old assumptions returned. But this time, Alexander did not remain silent. When someone questioned Julian's place beside the Sterling family, Alexander calmly responded, "He is here because I invited him." The simple statement surprised everyone. Alexander Sterling was known for making decisions based on logic, not emotion. Yet now he was openly choosing to stand beside Julian. Julian looked at him, unable to hide his surprise. After the event ended, they walked through the quiet halls of the estate. "You did not have to say that," Julian said. Alexander looked at him. "I know. Then why did you?" Alexander took a moment before answering. "Because I finally understand that silence can also be a choice. And I do not want to choose silence anymore." For years, Alexander had believed that being strong meant never allowing emotions to influence him. But Julian showed him that caring about someone did not make a person weaker. It made their choices more meaningful. Later that night, Alexander stood alone in his office, looking over the city lights. He thought about how much had changed. Julian was no longer someone he needed to figure out. He was someone Alexander wanted to know completely. Meanwhile, Julian sat by his window, thinking about the same evening. He had entered the Sterling estate expecting another battle for acceptance. Instead, he found something unexpected. Someone who chose to stand beside him before he even asked. The distance between them was almost gone. But both of them knew the next step would be the hardest. Because understanding someone was easy compared to admitting how much they had started to matter. The world around Julian Whitmore had slowly begun to change. The same people who once looked at him with suspicion were now forced to question everything they thought they knew. But Julian understood that changing opinions was not the same as changing hearts. He had spent too much of his life chasing acceptance, and he no longer wanted to measure his worth through other people's approval. The person who truly changed was not the world around him. It was Julian himself. Alexander Sterling noticed that more than anyone. The alpha who once believed emotions were distractions now found himself paying attention to the smallest details about Julian. The way he smiled when helping others. The way he stayed calm under pressure. The way he never used his difficult past as an excuse to hurt anyone else. Alexander had known many powerful people in his life, but Julian was different. His strength came from surviving difficult moments without losing his kindness. A few days after the family celebration, a major business event was held at Sterling Industries. Important guests from different companies gathered in the headquarters, and Julian attended beside Alexander. The moment they entered the room together, everyone noticed. Before, people would have wondered what Julian wanted. Now, they wondered why Alexander trusted him so openly. During the event, a conversation about family reputation brought old rumors back into the spotlight. Some guests questioned whether Julian truly belonged beside the Sterling family. Alexander remained calm, but Julian could see the familiar tension returning. This was the moment where the old Julian would have tried desperately to prove himself. But the person standing there now was different. I know people have their own opinions about me, Julian said calmly. But I cannot spend my life trying to change every person who refuses to know me. The room became quiet. His words were not angry. They were simply honest. Alexander looked at him with admiration. Julian no longer needed someone else to defend him because he had learned how to stand on his own. But Alexander still wanted to stand beside him. After the event ended, Alexander and Julian walked through the city streets of Chicago. The evening lights reflected on the buildings, and for once, neither of them felt the need to discuss rumors or expectations. "You have changed," Alexander said. Julian smiled slightly. "So have you." Alexander looked surprised. "How?" Julian thought for a moment. "You used to think control was the same as strength. Now you understand that trusting someone can be strength too." The words stayed with Alexander. He realized Julian was right. For years, he built walls around himself because he believed that was how powerful people survived. But Julian showed him that walls could protect someone while also keeping people away. Later that night, Alexander returned to his office and looked at the city from the window. He had achieved everything people expected from him: success, respect, influence. Yet none of those things felt as meaningful as the simple moments he shared with Julian. Meanwhile, Julian stood in his own apartment, realizing something he never expected. He came into the Sterling family believing he needed to protect himself from everyone. Instead, he found one person who saw through the rumors and chose to believe in him. The future he once feared was no longer something he wanted to escape. It was something he wanted to build. And standing beside him was the one person who had once been his greatest obstacle but had become his greatest source of comfort. The journey that began with misunderstanding had reached a moment neither Julian Whitmore nor Alexander Sterling expected. For so long, Julian believed his life would always be defined by other people's opinions. He was the Omega everyone judged before knowing the truth, the person everyone blamed before hearing his side of the story. But now, standing in the same world that once rejected him, Julian finally understood something important. His value had never depended on whether others accepted him. It had always been there. Alexander Sterling had learned that lesson too. The alpha who once believed everything could be controlled through logic had discovered that some of the most meaningful things in life could not be measured. Trust, understanding, connection. These were things he could not force or calculate. They were things he had to choose. Several months had passed since the night Alexander publicly stood beside Julian. The rumors that once followed Julian slowly faded as people began seeing his true character. They saw his patience, his intelligence, his kindness. They realized the person they called difficult was simply someone who had spent years protecting himself. At a community event hosted by Sterling Industries, Julian looked around at the people gathered together. The atmosphere was completely different from the first time he entered the Sterling world. There were no suspicious whispers, no judgmental looks, only genuine respect. Alexander stood beside him, watching the scene with quiet pride. "You never imagined this would happen," Alexander said. Julian smiled. "No, I thought I would always have to fight to be understood." Alexander looked at him. "And now?" Julian looked toward the people around them. "Now I know the right people will see the truth eventually." Those words reminded Alexander of how much Julian had changed. Or perhaps, how much Julian had always been the same. The world had simply taken too long to notice. Later that evening, they returned to the Sterling estate. The garden where they once had difficult conversations was peaceful under the evening sky. It was the same place where Alexander first admitted he wanted to understand Julian. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been?" Alexander asked. Julian considered the question carefully. He remembered the loneliness, the judgment, the moments when he believed nobody would ever truly know him. But he also remembered that without those experiences, he might never have become the person standing there now. "I used to wish everything had happened differently," Julian said. "But I do not anymore." Alexander looked at him. "Why?" Julian smiled softly. "Because I found something I never expected." Alexander understood before Julian finished speaking. The future was not perfect because the past disappeared. It was better because they had grown beyond it. The cold alpha who once saw Julian as someone to distrust had become the person who understood him most. The Omega, who was once labeled a villain, had become someone who no longer needed to prove his heart was good. Their story was never about changing who they were. It was about finally allowing each other to see the truth. And as the city lights shined beyond the garden, Julian and Alexander stepped into a future built not on rumors, expectations, or fear, but on trust, choice, and a bond created because they truly chose each other.